For someone who's hearing about Ossium Health for the first time, what is the mission?
So Ossium's mission is to improve human health through bioengineering. And specifically, the platform that we use to do that is a bone marrow bank, which is to say, when we do bone marrow transplants, what we're really doing is we're replacing the blood and immune system of a patient with that of the donor for the rest of their life. They produce blood and immune cells with the donor's genetics.
How do those requests come in from donor facilities? How that supply chain works?
20 different bone marrow transplant centers throughout the United States. And if one of those centers, has a patient, they'll simply search our bank to see if we have a matching donor for the patient. 65% of patients, and for 85% of patients, we have at least one match.
Hey, Kevin, welcome to the show. How are you today?
Well, thank you for having me, Chris. I'm doing well.
What part of the country are you calling in from?
I'm calling from our San Francisco headquarters here at Ossium.
I always like to get started and ask my guests to give a little bit of their backstory and how they arrived in the position they are. Can you tell us what you've done and kind of what led you to the CEO role at Ossium Health?
So you probably can't tell from my lack of a Southern accent, but I mostly grew up on a farm in West Tennessee with my grandparents. And that was an awesome experience. But one of the things that you observe when you spend a lot of time with your grandparents is that, by the time I was in high school, my primary caregivers were in the healthcare system quite a bit. And so I observed that they would get sick first, then they'd be taken to a physician who would retroactively sort of diagnose them with some indication and then prescribe an intervention that usually did reduce their suffering, but didn't really restore their health. And so I would ask questions about why we couldn't anticipate what would make them sick beforehand and why we weren't really bringing them back to the level of health I remembered them being at just a few months before. And the answer I typically got is, well, that's not how healthcare works. And so this initial experience actually kind of, I would say, soured me on the biological sciences and medicine. And, growing up, to me, I thought of, to be honest, to me, real science was physics, right? Biology was just sort of stamp collecting. And so I did a lot of things. I did astrophysics at MIT. I did an economics degree. I went to law school. I did all sorts of things. And I eventually found myself working at a major management consulting firm, sort of biopharma team. And essentially my job involved going into, clients were pharma companies who would be considering acquiring some biotech startup. And most of the ones that I worked with were thinking about acquiring various sort of cell and gene therapy startups of one kind or another. And I would be brought in sort of cold to diligence the company, learn about it, figure out what peak sales could potentially be, how competitive it would be with, other companies that other pharma companies were considering acquiring, and sort of build a model of the business and then recommend buy it or not. And this is how much you should pay for it. Typically, we'd have 3 weeks to make that recommendation, going through all the science behind the company and the market. And then we'd sleep for a couple of days and then go do it again. And so I worked in a few dozen different biotechs through this over a period of a few years. And the whole time I was sort of taking notes about what worked well and what didn't work well, these sort of cell and gene therapy companies. And Ossium is essentially my answer to that. It's sort of a company that's meant to learn from the successes and the failures of many efforts that came before us.
Well, tell us, for someone who's hearing about Ossium Health for the first time, what is the mission, Kevin, and what problem are you trying to solve in the market?
So Ossium's mission is to improve human health through bioengineering. And specifically, the platform that we use to do that is a bone marrow bank, which is to say, when we do bone marrow transplants, what we're really doing is we're replacing the blood and immune system of a patient with that of the donor for the rest of their life. They produce blood and immune cells with the donor's genetics. In principle, almost any blood or immune disease can be treated this way. It's arguably one of the most powerful procedures in medicine. And we believe at Ossium that it's been historically underutilized. It's been generally limited to cases where patients suffer from severe hematologic malignancies for a variety of reasons. Either it's too difficult to find a matched donor in time, the procedure's too dangerous because of the conditioning regimen that's required, or too dangerous because of the risk of rejection associated with doing a bone marrow transplant. And so the vision that we have is to make it possible to essentially reconstitute an immune system in a very low risk and very logistically sort of easy and expedient way so that the procedure can benefit more patients with the broader vision of making it possible to essentially sustain and improve our immunological health as a species over time. And so that fundamentally is what Ossium does.
In my experience, I've heard or learned that there's a lot of patients who are eligible for this type of, in many cases, life-saving therapy, but often don't get to a treatment center who could perform this type of transplant, blood cell transplant. Can you maybe walk us through the journey of a donor and what are some of the barriers that you see patients facing in getting access to this type of treatment?
Historically, there have been about 1.5 million bone marrow transplants around the world. And in the United States, we do about 10,000 allogeneic transplants. And that's where the donor and the patient are different people. You're taking cells from one person and infusing them into someone else every year. And if you look at the underlying data, the number of patients who are diagnosed with diseases that are treatable by a bone marrow transplant each year in the US is more like 60,000. And the number who go looking for a donor, who try to get a transplant, is actually close to 20,000. And so there's an enormous gap between the number of patients who need these treatments and the number who get them, however you measure it. A number of reasons for that gap, and those reasons have evolved over time. So when we do these transplants, it's very important that we match, at least historically it's been very important, that there be a close genetic match between the donor and the patient. We look at something called the human leukocyte antigen, or HLA type, of the patient and the donor. Basically, it's a part of the human genome that has a lot of variability between people and sort of identifies and is recognized by the cells. The cell uses it to recognize another cell as being sort of self-reformed. It plays a role in that process. And so in any event, for a long time, one challenge is that a lot of patients couldn't find matched donors in time. There are some techniques that have been developed in recent years which have made the problem of matching less challenging. Use of something called post-transplant cyclophosphamide, or PTCY, after a bone marrow transplant has reduced the risk of rejection from these transplants and allowed more mismatching to happen broadly. At Ossium, our bone marrow product has fewer of the cells that cause the rejection to happen, fewer of those naive T cells than living donor-derived bone marrow does, and that enables us to do transplants with more mismatches. So basically, two people don't have to be as similar to each other to receive a transplant and the rejection risk is not elevated. And so that's been a major change that's enabled more people to get access to treatment. There's also, though, a set of logistical challenges, actually. So, in order for a person to receive a bone marrow transplant, they need to be in complete remission, typically. And that state is temporary. A patient can relapse or die relatively suddenly when they have cancer. And so if you need to do a lengthy search for a volunteer donor that takes a few months, patients may expire during that search. And so one of the major advantages of Ossium's approach is that we've built a bank of these cells where we can deploy them off the shelf, not within months or weeks, but within days. We've done transplants with 48 hours notice before, where we learn that a patient exists, and 2 days later, our cells are being infused into them, and the patient engrafts and recovers. And so we've turned this procedure from something that requires multiple, months of search and the risk of patient deterioration during that process into a world where a transplant center can call us and say, "I'd like a bone marrow transplant, please," and we can deliver a product to them a couple of days later. So it's really a profound shift.
Could you maybe dive in a little bit more, Kevin, into the actual how you're actually re-engineering the blood supply? So in other words, I'm curious to see, I see how you're closing the gaps. Where are the donor material, the source material coming from? I suppose you are banking them and holding them so that there isn't as long of a wait for patients, right? Can you describe that a little bit more for us?
Sure. So maybe I can begin by describing, historically how these cells were usually attained, and then I can describe how our process diverges from that. So traditionally, there were really just two ways to get bone marrow stem cells. One is you could find some donor. It could be a relative if you're lucky enough to have a a relative who's a good match, or it could be a stranger who's a volunteer. And you need that person to either agree to have their hip drilled into and their bone marrow aspirated out, or more commonly these days, their stem cells mobilized and apheresed. The other source that you can use is an infant's placental cord blood, and that can provide material for a transplant. At Ossium, what we've and actually stepping back, if you look at our broader transplant ecosystem, you can kind of think of transplants as being there's organ transplants and there's bone marrow transplants, and throughout the world, including in the United States, historically, our organ transplant ecosystem has been primarily deceased donor based, right? About 80% of all organ transplants are from deceased donors. Whereas our bone marrow transplant ecosystem has been entirely living donor based before Ossium. So why is that, right? Because it turns out that the same solid organ donors, the deceased donors that have viable hearts, livers, lungs, kidneys, pancreases, they also have viable bone marrow, those same donors. And in fact, the way consent for organ recovery works, like if you sign up to be an organ donor, and there's 160 plus million registered organ donors in the US. Most US adults are registered organ donors. You're consenting for everything. And so why was it that the bone marrow wasn't recovered? Well, that ties back to what we talked about earlier, which is that for bone marrow, you can't just take the bone marrow from one donor and infuse them into a patient who needs a transplant. You really have to match them genetically. And the probability that a patient who needs a bone marrow transplant today matches a donor who happens to pass away today is not that high. The only way you could make it work was to bank it. And so when our transplantation ecosystem was emerging in the 1950s and 60s, we landed on this model where we used deceased donors for organs and living donors for bone marrow because they couldn't bank the bone marrow and they couldn't do transplants in real time. So the only option was to have a registry of volunteers. And so you ended up with this entire ecosystem for transplantation that was reliant on people being ready, willing, and able to take time out of their lives, right? Take time off from work, away from their families, and undergo a procedure that's sort of painful for a total stranger. Now that is a Herculean that every person who's made a bone marrow donation has made. The basic insight behind Ossium is that we can take this robust organ donation ecosystem that we already have and bring it into the fight against cancer and actually use this, what ultimately will be a much more robust, much more real-time sort of platform for enabling transplants for blood cancer patients. And so in particular, we've developed processes at Ossium for doing very high fidelity cryopreservation and thawing of bone marrow so that the yields we get are much higher than people could get historically. We get 90 to 95% of our cells are still viable post-thaw from most of our donors. With historical methods for trying to bank these cells, they would lose 60 or 70% of the cells, and even those they retained weren't dysfunctional. There are modern processes that I mentioned earlier that allow you to do more mismatched transplants. And then our product also is optimized to have ratios of cells that are more favorable, so more of the stem cells that you want for engraftment, and fewer of the naive T cells, the lymphocytes that drive rejection. One advantage of using organ donors is that we're able to recover many more cells from an organ donor than you can take from a volunteer, because if you or I were to donate bone marrow, Chris, we still need our bone marrow. And so there'd be an ethical obligation for the team recovering cells from us to take actually the minimum number that can successfully engraft in the patient, because the last thing you ever want to do is harm the donor if you're doing this procedure, right? Whereas from an organ donor, we can take all the bone marrow. And so that means that we can treat multiple patients per donor or give higher doses to patients. And so all of these are major advantages of this approach. And so for us, the way the process is sort of looks is there's an accident, could be a motorcycle accident, where something happens that causes some person who's otherwise young and healthy to become an organ donor. Typically, the person has consented to donation prior to death. The local organ procurement organization, these are sort of nonprofit organizations, will go to their family, notify them that their loved one chose to give the gift of life, and ask the family to confirm that they consent for donation. If the family confirms, they'll schedule the recovery for the organ. And if they're one of the groups that's working with us, then they'll also ask the family specifically if they can take vertebral bodies, the bone that we use for bone marrow processing. In general, we find families almost always honor the loved one's wishes if they decided to be a donor. And in general, if they're honoring those wishes, they're not particular about which organs are taken and which ones are not. They generally will consent to everything. And so then the organization, while the sort of chest cavity is open and the organs are recovered, they'll recover bone for bone marrow processing, and that will be shipped to our facility, and we'll process the tissue and produce the bone marrow cells for cryopreservation. We'll do a bunch of testing on them to confirm that the cells are viable and functional and sort of appropriate for release, held at the facility in liquid nitrogen vapor, and until a patient is identified who could be a match for those cells. And then once that patient is identified, the cells are shipped to a bone marrow transplant center for use for the blood cancer patient.
Yeah, thanks. I was going to follow up, but that's a great overview, by the way. Really understand that. Now let's talk a little bit now about the business model and how do those requests come in from donor facilities? I don't know, maybe academic centers, bone marrow transplant, cellular therapy service lines, hospital systems. Tell us a little bit about those partnerships or how that supply chain works.
Today, we work with about 20 different bone marrow transplant centers throughout the United States. And if one of those centers, has a patient, they'll simply search our bank to see if we have a matching donor for the patient. If we typically will have multiple matches, so we have 2 or more matches for, I would say, about 65% of patients, and for 85% of patients, we have at least one match. They consider, we'll provide them with detailed information on the donor, so donor age and sex, and then some information about the donor's medical history, et cetera. They'll make the dose of cells available, et cetera. The physician treating the patient will make a decision as to, which donor they want, typically in consultation with our team. They'll schedule the bone marrow transplant. Prior to the transplant, there's something called conditioning that happens where the patient's native blood and immune system is ablated. We'll typically ship the cells to the transplant center ahead of conditioning so that they're ready for the procedure. They'll do that, and then a few days after conditioning, they'll thaw the cells, and then do the infusion. The thawing could be an hour before the transplant, and then they'll within 2 to 3 weeks after the cell infusion, sometimes faster, but typically between around 13 and 21 days, the patient will achieve engraftment, and the transplant center will share that data with us, and indeed they share continuously throughout the experience. They'll share patient data with us, and we monitor them for safety and efficacy.
Your company talks about improving health, vitality, and longevity. How do you see donor-derived cell therapies fitting into the broader, immune health span and longevity conversation that's really hot at the moment?
Right. In general, human beings die of disease, which is to say, unless a person dies from an accident or some sort of tragic event, sudden event, people die of disease. And so fundamentally, our immune system's job is to prevent and address disease within the body, whether that is identifying sort of a foreign pathogen invader that is at risk of causing us a sort of viral or bacterial illness, or whether it's identifying cells that have developed cancer mutations and sort of terminating a tumor before it gets too large. Like, the function of the immune system, when it's working properly, is to address disease. And so therefore, I would argue that all of our immune systems eventually fail us in one way or another. The question is how and when. And the way that and so the basic goal behind Ossium is to make it possible, significantly improve the functionality, the health, the flexibility, and the specificity of our immune system, even as we age. Precisely because we believe that's a very powerful lever that can be pulled to improve our resistance to all disease. And I would characterize, I think the most useful definition of a true longevity intervention is any intervention that delays or prevents the onset of sort of multiple diseases across different systems of the body. I would characterize that as a longevity intervention. And I would argue that it's hard to conceive of a longevity intervention more broad and more potent than simply making your immune system better at resisting disease with time as you age. And so that's how we think about it. And then in terms of the relationship between the work that we're doing now and this broader goal, a basic belief that we have about how to achieve really, really profound and meaningful change in our healthcare ecosystem is you should identify sort of a long-term vision, dramatically, improving our immune health as we age, and then identify some that may take you 30 years to do, right? And then identify some near term, some focused achievement that you can make that'll put you a meaningful step closer to that long-term goal and genuinely sort of help patients in need and genuinely build sort of capabilities that are valuable. And so I mentioned earlier that ultimately all of our immune systems fail us, right? Which is why humans die of disease. Well, I would also argue that in many ways, the blood cancers are the most dramatic example of that. The immune system itself has become malignant and is actually the direct cause of cancer and death. And so really what we're doing is we've identified this situation where there's a catastrophic failure of the immune system, and we're improving our methods for addressing that in a way that is already in the real world right now saving the lives of blood cancer patients, as well as building a set of capabilities and tools and fundamental insights that we can use to help much broader sets of patients prior to these catastrophic failures happening.
Kevin, what's your point of view on using this bioengineered bank to help support, like one of the hot areas is this is off the shelf, sort of allogeneic, like using a donor cell for cellular therapies, right? There's a lot of companies exploring that, and because that would be great because it'll really shorten the time, right, compared to autologous where you're using your patient's own cells. So like, it seems to me like this is an excellent use case. Is that something you're looking at or have a point of view on?
It is. It's a great question. So, I think you're referring to these chimeric antigen receptor T cell therapies or CAR T therapies. And the ones that are already approved and that have been around since the last decade are mostly autologous CAR Ts where the patient's own immune cells, own T cells are modified genetically and then sort of reinfused. And essentially they're engineered. They have this, it's called chimera because they're given this receptor that doesn't exist in nature that's engineered to sort of target a cancer. And that's been, those procedures have been, it's some incredible science underpinning those. But as you point out, one of the major limitations they have is that they can be quite slow. They're very expensive, and they haven't scaled tremendously well, precisely because they're autologous. Because at the end of the day, what you're doing is you're making a custom drug for each patient, and that is not scalable. And so actually, I mentioned at the outset that earlier in my career, I would go into many of these biotech companies to sort of value them and assess them for the pharma companies that were considering acquiring them. And many of these were companies that were working on CAR T therapies of one kind or another. And essentially all of them were at the time were working on autologous therapies. And they all had trouble scaling then, now sort of 12, 13 years ago. And they still are having trouble scaling it. It still hasn't happened. And so one of the basic insights behind Ossium was that if this profoundly possible, a powerful class of interventions that enables you, to go in and edit the genetics of a lymphocyte to have it target a cancer, that's just, it's an incredibly, it's a revolutionary approach to cancer therapy. If this was really going to be made available, not to just a few hundred patients in clinical studies, but ultimately to hundreds of thousands of patients around the world who were really going to scale this, it was going to be critical that we develop an off-the-shelf version of it. That's something you can manufacture at scale and deploy. And for that to happen, you need a source of allogeneic. It has to be allogeneic. It has to be that the product was already made before you identified who the patient is. And you need a source of allogeneic T cells that you can use for that. So a vast and genetically diverse bank of whole bone marrow, including T cells, T lymphocytes from donors. We can select any subpopulation of cells we want from that bone marrow, and those cells can be manipulated and infused. And so yes, the bank that we have could become a foundation for a set of allogeneic T cell therapies, and that certainly is something that we're looking into.
Kevin, that's great news. I know it's down the road a ways, but I mean, this is the future. And I think while we're looking into the future, I want to look ahead for a moment. And as we wrap up here today, what does success look like for you personally? Is it, a certain number of patients who are transplanted? Is it, or a future where every organ donor can also be a stem cell donor? I mean, what does it look like to you personally?
I would say that the vision that I and my co-founder, Eric Woods, who also serves as our chief science officer, had when we started Ossium almost exactly 10 years ago now, in February of 2016. The basic idea that we have is we want to make it fundamentally possible when a patient is thinking about their future health, for it to be possible for your blood and immune system and its condition to be viewed as something that can be rejuvenated, reprogrammed, reconstituted, not as part of not post hoc because you already have a malignancy and you're on the edge of death and you're going to undergo this incredibly painful, this high risk procedure, but as part of the ordinary course of medicine, even as a preventative tool, and in a way that is safe and logistically easy. We want to, and so there's a few things on the road to that. One, we want every patient who needs a cell therapy, every patient suffering from a blood or immune disease who would benefit from a cell therapy, to be able to receive one, and for access to a donor, for finding a donor somewhere in the world to never be a barrier for a patient getting treatment. So that's sort of step one. Step two is making it possible to deliver that treatment with minimal friction to the patient and to the transplant center, and minimal risk. And then step three is making it possible for those treatments for patients who actually don't yet have catastrophic illnesses, but are at risk of getting it, to prevent those illnesses. That's kind of the three-step vision that we have.
Well, Kevin, this is fascinating, and I want to thank you for all the work that you're doing to help close the access gaps, to help make this biobanking and donor material, starting material, more available, being more timely, especially as we're moving into a future of medicine where advanced cellular therapies and regenerative medicines, are becoming more widely used. I just see this as becoming even more important as we go forward. So thanks for joining us today and sharing all the great work you're doing.
Well, thank you for having me, Chris.
Okay, take care.
If you enjoyed this conversation, be sure to subscribe to the RX for Biotech podcast to hear directly from the leaders who are shaping the future of personalized medicines. And if you or someone you know is navigating a care journey, be sure to visit therapyforme.ai to search for a specialist near you. And if you need that extra support, be sure to schedule a virtual telehealth appointment with one of our nurse navigators who can help answer your questions. Thank you for listening.